With a face that can transform into almost anything and an energy that simply can't be contained, this video is clear proof of why Jim Carrey deserves a place at the very top of comedy's Hall of Fame.
She actually stole, wow, look at this, I can do anything with it. Working, not working. Oh, they got you coming and going, man, you know what I mean? You try and you try and you give it all. You give it all to her. This is an incredible transformation.
It is an incredible transformation. Who was the teacher
Watch
you
this.
drew? Oh, yeah, all right.
There are very few people in the world who can walk into a room and instantly make everyone forget how to be normal. Jim Carrey is one of those people. It does not matter if you are a famous actor, a late-night host, or just someone sitting in the audience. The moment Jim opens his mouth or makes a move, all bets are off. Composure goes out the window. Professionalism disappears. People just lose it. That is the kind of effect this man has had on the world of comedy for decades. And honestly, nobody does it quite like him. If you enjoy watching moments where legends completely fall apart laughing, where the most serious people on television cannot hold themselves together, then you are in exactly the right place. Make sure you subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss these kinds of videos. We put together the best moments, the funniest clips, and the most unforgettable scenes from entertainers who genuinely changed the game. Now, let us get into it. One of the most interesting things about Jim Carrey is that his sense of humor was not something he developed on his own in a vacuum. He grew up watching it happen naturally around him, especially with his father. Jim has talked about his dad many times over the years, and the way he describes him is genuinely hilarious. According to Jim, his father was simply one of the happiest men alive. The guy laughed at everything. No matter what you said to him, he would respond with laughter. But here's the twist that makes the whole thing even funnier. His father was also deaf in one ear, so the move was always the same. He would lean in to hear what you said, and then he would laugh. Lean in, laugh. Lean in, laugh. Jim does the impression of this so well that you can picture the whole thing perfectly just from listening to him describe it. It's one of those observations that feels small, but tells you everything about where Jim got his instinct for finding humor in everyday life. Now, Jim Carrey did not stay poor his whole life. He went from struggling and barely getting by to becoming one of the highest-paid actors in Hollywood history. And like many people who go through that kind of dramatic change, he started noticing things about himself that shifted along with the money. One of the most amusing things he noticed was how his laugh changed at parties. When he was a regular guy without much money, his laugh was completely genuine and unfiltered. He would just crack up naturally like any normal person would. But once the money came in and he started moving in wealthier circles, he noticed that the laugh at those kinds of events was completely different. Rich people have a very particular way of laughing at parties, and Jim nailed it perfectly. Instead of just laughing freely, it becomes this controlled, polished, almost performative sound. He demonstrated this on camera, and it is one of those bits that sticks with you, because there's so much truth baked into it. It's not just a joke, it's a real observation about how money and social status quietly change the way people present themselves, even in something as automatic as laughter. When it comes to award shows, most people play it safe. They get up, they thank their team, they thank their family, they try to look humble and grateful, and they sit back down. Jim Carrey has never been interested in doing things that way. At one point, he stood up in front of a room full of Hollywood's biggest names and declared that his dream was to be a 3-time Golden Globe-winning actor, specifically himself. He didn't pretend to be humble about it, he just leaned right into it and owned the moment in a way that nobody else in that room could have pulled off. It was bold, it was funny, and it worked completely because it came from a place of total confidence. Jim has always been someone who believed in speaking things into existence before they happened, and this was basically him doing that live on stage in the most entertaining way possible. Speaking of believing things before they happen, Jim Carrey is genuinely serious about manifestation and visualization. He's talked about this in interviews many times, and people know the famous story about the check he wrote to himself for $10 million before he had that kind of money. But his humor around the topic of dreaming big takes it to a whole other level. In one interview, he casually mentioned that he had been getting into real estate, Normal enough so far, but then he explained that his approach to real estate was a little different from the average investor. He had started renaming cities and countries after himself. Jimdonia. He was mapping out entire regions of the world and putting his name on them in his imagination. It's the kind of joke that works on multiple levels because it sounds ridiculous, but it also perfectly captures the energy of someone who genuinely does not put a ceiling on what they think is possible. When you have the mindset that helped you go from nothing to one of the most famous people on the planet, apparently renaming Madagascar doesn't seem that far out of reach. Then there was the period when Jim stepped away from Hollywood and came back looking noticeably different, mainly because he had grown out a very full, wild beard, and people had a lot of questions about it. But Jim flipped the whole conversation on its head immediately. He pointed out that nobody was asking the real question, which in his mind was not why he was growing a beard, but rather why a man would grow a beard on his face while still maintaining a completely different grooming standard elsewhere. He turned this into a full bit about balance, explaining it as some kind of cosmic equilibrium. If one area grows, another must be kept tidy. It is completely absurd, and that is exactly why it works. He then left the audience with a parting thought about what would happen if he ever did decide to shave the beard, suggesting that the facial hair would have to go somewhere. That line landed perfectly because the delivery was so calm and matter-of-fact, like he was explaining basic physics. One of the more unexpectedly sweet and funny topics Jim has talked about is being a grandfather. He became a granddad, and by his own admission, he was genuinely surprised by this development, even though logically he should not have been. But the funny part was not the fact of being a grandfather. It was the ongoing battle he had with his grandchild about what to be called. Jim was very clear that he did not want to be called Grandpa. He told the kid this directly and firmly, and of course, because kids understand exactly how to get under the skin of the adults in their lives, the child immediately figured out that this was the best possible button to push, so naturally he kept calling him Grandpa. Jim described the situation with this perfectly timed observation that every single time the kid said the word Grandpa, Jim felt himself getting a little bit older. It is one of those jokes that is also kind of philosophically true, which is the best kind of joke. Age is partly a feeling, and being reminded of your role as the oldest generation in the room does have a way of making time feel very real. Jim Carrey has always been someone who uses humor to process and cover things that are genuinely painful. He has spoken openly over the years about mental health, depression, and a childhood that was not easy. His mother ended up in a psychiatric institution when he was still a teenager. His family struggled financially for years. These are not light topics, but Jim has this ability to briefly brush up against the truth of those things on camera before immediately retreating back into the joke, not because he is avoiding it, but because making people laugh is genuinely how he has always navigated the weight of being alive. There is a clip where an interviewer introduces a very heavy summary of his background, and Jim immediately turns it into a punchline, but you can tell there is something real underneath it. That tension between the pain and the humor is actually what makes his comedy feel different from most. It never feels completely weightless, even when it is making you cry from laughing. One of the most relatable problems that comes with fame is having to answer the same interview questions over and over again. Every tour, every press cycle, every movie release brings the same round of questions from reporters who all want to cover the same ground. Jim found a way to make this bearable, at least for himself. He started changing his answers, not just tweaking them slightly, but completely reinventing them each time. In one moment, he asked an interviewer to ask him whether he enjoyed working with animals. The interviewer played along, asked the question, and Jim answered enthusiastically. Then he asked them to ask again. Same question, completely different energy, different answer, different level of intensity. By the third time, the thing had escalated into something unrecognizable from a normal interview response. It was a perfect demonstration of how a mind like his can not just do the expected thing. Even when the question is boring, the answer does not have to be. Jim once shared what he described as foolproof advice for walking into a singles bar and making an impression. The strategy involved a very specific entrance, a very particular posture, and a whistle. The whole thing was physical and hard to fully capture in words, but the punchline was essentially that the move communicates one very clear message to everyone in the room without any confusion about intentions. He delivered this as though it were genuine wisdom being passed down.
That contrast between the absurdity of the content and the complete seriousness of the presentation is something Jim does better than almost anyone. He commits fully to the bit, and that commitment is what pushes it from funny to unforgettable. The story about having dinner with Anthony Hopkins is one of those behind-the-scenes Hollywood moments that sounds almost too good to be real. Jim invited Hopkins over for dinner, and at some point during the meal, the conversation turned to acting techniques. Jim explained how he approached his character in Ace Ventura, drawing on the energy of a highly intelligent bird. Then Hopkins responded by breaking down how he had built Hannibal Lecter. He described the character as a combination of a crocodile and a tarantula, something cold and patient, with the ability to wait indefinitely for exactly the right moment. As Hopkins apparently got further and further into this explanation, the dinner table started to feel genuinely unsettling.
Jim described the moment where he had to break the tension by offering more roast beef because the alternative was sitting there while one of the greatest actors alive stared at him like he was prey. It is one of those stories where the humor comes entirely from the situation being real. Nobody had to exaggerate anything. The combination of those two specific people in that specific setting was already funny on its own. Jim also shared a story about trying to live anonymously in public using nothing but a fake mustache, thick glasses, and a baseball cap. He was fairly confident he was pulling it off. He moved through the crowd, felt like a regular person, started to think maybe this was the answer. Maybe this was how he could finally just exist in the world without being recognized. Then he approached a vendor, waited to be served, and looked up to find the vendor staring at him in complete silence with an expression that said everything. The disguise had not worked at all. The vendor knew exactly who was standing in front of him and was apparently too stunned to say anything. Jim had managed to achieve the worst possible outcome, being recognized while also looking strange. Throughout all of these moments, whether he is at an award show, sitting across from a talk show host, standing in a room with Anthony Hopkins, or trying to go unnoticed in public, the one thing that connects everything is that Jim Carrey is always entirely himself. He does not turn it off for the camera and turn it back on when the red light goes on. There is no version of him that is carefully managed or polished into something safe. What you see is what he actually is, someone whose brain works differently from most, who finds the humor in everything, who has used laughter as both a shield and a gift for his entire life. That is rare. And it is why, decades into his career, a clip of Jim Carrey being Jim Carrey can still make a room full of people completely fall apart.